All right, coming from across from beautiful BC and usually Calgary, Alberta, this is Left to the Valley 2.0. My name is Kevin, and I found a piece of clothing that after 25 years still fits me. Turns out it's a scarf, but nonetheless, it counts. Joining me today is Valerie Tarico. Valerie, how you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, hold on a sec. We got to give you the applause, right? We got the large applause just for you, right? Valerie is an author, and she's also a PhD in counseling psychology. And today we'll be talking about an interesting subject, the subject of wokeness. But before we dive into all this, Valerie, maybe you'd be so kind to give us a quick bio as to who Valerie Tarico is.
Thanks, Kevin. So I grew up in evangelical fundamentalism and Dallas Seminary, if anybody knows what that tradition is. By my own choice, I went to Wheaton College in Illinois. That's Billy Graham's alma mater. And then gradually made my way out of evangelicalism as I struggled with the rational and moral contradictions in my worldview and my view of God. And ultimately ended up writing a book called Trusting Doubt. A former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light. That opened the door for me to do a bunch of work in terms of writing for online news and opinion sites, where I've spent time in the last decade writing about not just Christian fundamentalism, a critique of religious fundamentalism more broadly, but more specifically, eventually, the role of women in society and reproductive rights and health, and then contraceptive technologies specifically. And then on top of that, my work in the last 10 to almost 15 years now has really focused on empowering the left half of the political spectrum, helping donors to channel funding to broad progressive infrastructure, think tank capacity, youth civic engagement, voter file technology, the kinds of things that aren't super sexy, but that help to make advocacy across the spectrum more effective. And then lastly, I have been moving gradually my time and energy and passion into the question of sustainable food and what protein production is going to look like in coming generations. And
Oh, yeah,
so
you
that's
gotta
it.
have all this on a business card. Tell me, right?
Yeah. I gave up on business cards a while back.
Hi, Christine. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. And now that two-step authentication or whatever that I was forced to set up is done, I'm here. I'm sorry. I
That's
apologize for
nice.
that.
Thank you for joining us.
Hi,
First of
Valerie.
all,
I'm Chris.
Hi, Chris. Nice to meet you.
You too.
I just want to bow down to Valerie because that introduction was like, oh my God, she's got so much going on here. All hail the queen. My God.
Yeah. Well, I saw your website too, and very impressive. A lot of
Yeah.
great material there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully I'm up to the challenge to interview such a,
Well,
a
thanks. As
strong.
you can see, I'm getting wrinkles. And when you put that much time over, kind of over a decade into writing articles for online news and opinion sites, all of a sudden you look at it and go, holy crow, there's what, 400, 500, 600 articles here. It really
Yeah.
does add
Wow.
up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Valerie, we brought you here today because we wanted to talk about wokeness. And you'll have to explain this because I'm an idiot and I'll be the first one to admit to that. I hear the term wokeness and I try to understand and I try to be supportive. And there's so much controversy from one side to the political spectrum to the next. And I was hoping that you'd be able to give us at least an introduction as to what it is, what it should be, and has it gone too far? As far as is it hindering us in our development of society? Is it helping us? So anyway, maybe we'll start from the start. What would be your definition of wokeness?
So you're just asking me to define a grand theory of everything, basically,
Well, somebody who can do it is
from
probably
a
you.
social psychological standpoint. um, let me at least take a swing at part of that. When, of course, as you probably and your listeners know, the term woke has roots back decades ago in the Black civil rights movement and the idea of people becoming increasingly aware of the kinds of bigotries that are persistent in society and the ways that those kinds of bigotries have gotten embedded in cultural institutions like the court system or policing or lending or zoning. So there's kind of basically there's a lot of folks, some in ethnic minority communities and particular white communities, who have been fairly blind to those things unless they were getting whomped with it personally.
Mhm.
And so that's where the term came from. unfortunately, it has become a blanket term used broadly, but to kind of talk about more identitarian dynamics in society. So there's this philosophy, social philosophy, if you will, the critical race theory stuff that traces its roots back to the Frankfurt School of Philosophy and early Marxism, even though a leftist like me is not supposed to acknowledge that, but it's very explicit in the early writers around critical race theory. And the kind of idea of that, akin to classical Marxism, is that there are a clump of people who are oppressors and a clump of people who are oppressed, and that the kind of the structure of society is primarily one that revolves around power dynamics, and it kind of has a zero sum quality to it. So wokeism has come to be a term that refers to the idea that people are bought into this notion that that is the kind of core dynamic in society, that there are oppressors and oppressed. And it's not a matter of our individual lived experience. It's a matter of, I hate to say it, but kind of, it's a very tribal conception of oppression and or struggle, and the idea that that you are either a member of an oppressed tribe or an oppressor tribe, independent of what your actual life experience has been. And then that there are mistrusts that should be there. There are debts owed. There are a sense of victimization. And unfortunately, kind of the idea psychologically is that power comes from within these subcultures. Power comes from essentially competitive victimhood. So you create you look at what have been the traditional pecking orders of hierarchy in society, with kind of straight white males at the top of European, kind of Europeans. There's lots of reasons that history evolved. There's lots of biological reasons for that. And then what you and it has had horrific consequences for a bunch of people. And so what's happening in these subcultures is you essentially invert that pecking order. So it would be like I don't know, a queer woman of color, at the top of the pecking order, and the straight white guys are being asked to take their turn at the bottom because people who look like them have had it way too good for too long. So that's kind of how I see the woke dynamics playing out in the political context in which I am immersed here in Seattle.
So if going back to the point of tribalism here, where you talk about a class of being the oppressor, a class being the oppressed, and people viewing this in this light, are they correct as compared to the current political uh, status of the United States?
Well, there's a lot of squishy talk and squishy thinking. It's really clear, kind of, that certain tribes have had advantage based on inborn characteristics that have nothing to do with personal merit or effort, and that to some degree the kind of consequences of that ripple down through history, kind of creating intergenerational trauma or intergenerational disadvantage. And that we need to continue to look at what the residual is, for example, of sexism and racism in our society, because there definitely is residual. On the other hand, what you do if you listen to folks is almost treating people as if we were proxies for our ancestors, right? So it's almost a matter of indifference if your ancestors weren't even on this continent during the time of kind of slavery, for example. Whether you are black or white, somehow you get treated as if some of those violations and offenses kind of had directly kind of happened at your hand, and that there is this notion of inherited guilt. Literally, a lot of this draws on evangelical Christian thinking and teaching, which is why I find myself sensitized to it, right? The idea that kind of slavery was America's original sin, the idea that there is inherited guilt, there are kind of, privileged bloodlines all of that is kind of very present in the Iron Age texts of the Bible, um, and and I think continues to play out those ideas in a counterproductive way in society.
Hmm. That's very interesting because I can understand that the message of wokeness would be to try to level the playing field, but it seems that um, this message is not getting through for some reason. And you think is it because of that tribalism? We just love the black and white dynamic. Is our brain too primitive to understand the subtlety of this message?
That's such a good question.
There's no subtlety in the message, may I say.
What I think, if I look at both left and right now in the United States, there is this very kind of clear retrenchment into identitarian dynamics, right? So in the middle of the 20th century, there was a long trajectory, in fact, of struggle for civil rights and equality in this country that was really rooted in the Enlightenment values, of kind of fairness and of independence and of free thought and inquiry, and also rooted, I would say, deeply in our shared humanity, the idea that we are all a part of this kind of greater whole together, and that independent, kind of apart from our tribes, kind of wherever we come from, that there are things that we have in common. And then the other part of the Enlightenment values has been that, to focus on our unique individualism, right? So I actually had a client at one point who brought in a quote that I've since quoted many times, which is that in some ways I am like all other people, in some ways I am like some other people, and in some ways I'm like no other person.
Hmm.
So the struggle of civil rights in past generations and of the Enlightenment values focuses on the first and third of those, the ways in which I am like all other people, and the ways in which I am a unique individual. And human history prior to that largely identified people in terms of that middle group. I am like some other people. I am like my tribe, and even if you look at the way that the golden rule is articulated in some societies, like in, for example, the biblical societies, it's like a matter of males of my same lineage or bloodline that merit being treated according to the golden rule, right? So kind of ethical principles get boundary based on tribes, and our struggle in the last several hundred years actually has been to transcend that. But I think that there was also an ignoring or a denying or a minimizing of the way in which our membership in tribes can profoundly affect a person's life course and their opportunities, right? So kind of think, if what you're trying to do is create a level playing field, we can't not acknowledge how profoundly race and sex, sexual orientation, some of all of those identity check boxes that woke people are so fixated on have been incredibly powerful determinants of people's opportunity, and have in fact created a really unequal playing field. I don't personally think that the right response to that is to kind of retrench back into tribal identities,
Hmm.
and for each of us to kind of take on a fight that is a fight for, quote, my people, rather than a fight for our shared humanity and our unique individualism.
Hmm. Yeah, I recall seeing back in the golden age of comic books, there used to be like little cartoons of. I remember this particular one where Superman was actually talking to a group of people, and he was talking about how to be American. How to not judge other people, no matter what race, religion, stuff like that. It seemed that at that time, America was on its way to be more woke, but for um, some reason, like you said, this primal urge of tribalism has pulled us back, and I just don't understand why, if as a society, we're retracting in this situation when it seemed to be so clear, and we're talking about a few decades ago. Why
Yeah,
why
after the hippie era kind of thing, during the hippie era,
yeah
yeah,
why is
peace
it
and
that
love, and yeah.
why is it that now we seem to be going back to, for lack of a better term, a more primitive state of ourselves?
I kind of think of it as a more primitive state, although I realize that's an oversimplification. But yeah,
Mhm.
you hear stories like I read something yesterday about a young African girl in an American classroom, a girl kind of who is an immigrant from Africa, saying in the classroom, her, kind of that we are all the same, that we are all kind of people and human beings, and being chastised by her woke teacher,
Mm.
which is a painful thing to hear, right? So I do think in term that there are clearly stories of excesses that circulate in particular on the right, but they also circulate on the left. But why are we retrenching? Because it's not just the left. Obviously, what you see on the right is all of these people retrenching into nationalism,
Hmm.
into white nationalism specifically, in some quarters into kind of like a sense of competitive turfiness around who should get what, and resentment of outsiders, resentment of immigrants, resentment of people who don't look like me or don't talk like me or don't, more specifically, increasingly in the United States, is people who don't think like me.
Hmm.
There's a lot of folks who are like, I don't care what you look like, as long as you think like me. And I, as a psychologist, I don't have a clear answer to that. I've not read one that is particularly persuasive, but I think when you look at our current context, there are these huge subterranean pressures on people, right? That what we are up against some of Earth's boundaries in terms of the finiteness of natural resources. Kind of people started talking about overpopulation in the 60s, and it became taboo to talk about that among left-wing people, and among right-wing people for different reasons, basically. But the fact is, population, we are not on a sustainable trajectory, and I think at some gut level people know that. I think even people who deny that climate change is a serious threat at some gut level are experiencing it, and experiencing the changes and things that go with it. We have, kind of, I I actually think that I believe in capitalism with strong social controls,
Hmm.
and ways of redistributing resources. But so I'm not anti-capitalist, but I do think that unfettered capitalism has created um, all kinds of externalities that, we've kind of pushed problems onto people who were vulnerable, and onto future generations, and onto other species in ways that are not sustainable,
Hmm.
and have kind of devastated resources. So like basically, for example, I was in New Zealand in a small town once, and I remember reading that in the 1970s, technologies reached the point that they could kill in 1 year the number of whales that they had killed in decades previously. And then lo and behold, all of a sudden, there's the population is gone, right? The population of the whales, the resources are gone. And so I think that all around us are people who are feeling that at a gut level. And I think when people are threatened, that they tend to become more selfish and more tribal.
I could absolutely understand why the right wing, the right end of the spectrum, retreats into individualism because they feel they are being attacked. They feel their identity is being attacked. Oh, my ancestors did that. I didn't do that. I can understand that. What puzzles me is the left side retreating into tribalism and individualism. And humor me here for a second, Valerie, because you're a very smart person. So I got to ask somebody like you. Here's a pet hypothesis of mine. We live in a society right now with our capitalistic system that encourages individualism. I mean, we're a social species. We depend on each other for survive. But yet we always watch shows, for example, on TV where the one guy stabs everybody else to climb on top of everybody else, to pile on top. We reward the individual that goes for personal glory. Whether it's any show like Survivor, anything, any of those weird shows that people watch and crave. We crave the drama of betrayal and individualism itself. So could our own economic system have something to do and fuel this entire move towards tribalism?
Um, uh, well, I think that to some degree, all economic systems that I've ever seen that actually are effective in producing the goods and services that people want and need, um, also create inequality and to some degree competitiveness, although there are ways to mitigate that. Um, the other thing that you touch on there is kind of like is the media kind of what's the story the media is telling about us, about ourselves and our society, right? Because we are a species of social information specialists, right? That's our unique niches that we live in community with each other, and most of what we understand about the world we get from each other, and we are storytellers first and foremost.
Hmm.
So even when we have aggregated data, for example, a lot of times the best way for people to communicate and remember that is to pick a story that is kind of on the center of gravity for whatever that aggregated data may tell us about ourselves. And then, whether it's about cancer or whether it's about, whatever it is, right? Or whether an epidemic, or whether it's about forest getting cut down, you pick something that is representative and then tell a story. And that's the way we internalize cause and effect relationships. And if you look at what's going, like what you said about the media is, you listen to almost any kind of series on TV or movie,
Hmm.
and people in real life don't talk to each other the way that people do in movies. They say things on movies that would be completely unforgivable, actually, within families and communities. People are much less cooperative. That you don't see people in movies doing the hard work of creating and constructing and building, right? Because that's more slow. It's less sexy. So what we see is the destructive aspects of human nature, but not the constructive aspects of human nature. And and I, as much as anything, yes, there is a kind of individualistic streak to like American society. For example, again, even in Christianity, it's a much less communal form of Christianity. It's about individual salvation, and our economic system rewards individual hard work as well as collaboration. But I think that I also wonder if the stories that we're telling ourselves, that we're creating and producing, are part of the problem, that they're actually changing our sense over time of who we are and what it means to live in community with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it seems at this point we've so made such a turn towards individualism that we look at community and we like you were talking a bit earlier about Marxism. Right off the bat, we accuse it of communism as soon as we think of community. It seems that we can't. We're so focused on the individual. It seems even getting harder to even fathom the idea of working as a whole. And I think that's a very big deterrent because, like I said earlier, we are a social species. It's going to come and bite us in the butt at some point.
Well, if you look at economic systems, right, it seems to me that the systems that have produced the greatest well-being for the populations or at large are what I think of as hybrid systems that combine that engine of innovation and kind of competition, if you will, that is inherent in capitalism, that kind of fosters creativity, that fosters certain kinds of efficiencies and kind of flow of resources and in production. But then they are hybrid in the sense that they also recognize that capitalism essentially operates like natural selection in the economic sphere, right? It doesn't really care about what it kind of like systems will outcompete other systems regardless of whether they actually promote human well-being or not.
Mhm.
And so you have to kind of have this hybrid values layer in which you've got something that is powerful enough to go up against capitalism and say, we are a social species and we live in community with each other. We depend on each other. Altruism is as much a part of our species as competition is. And we've got to kind of find ways to have levers and forces and powers that ensure that though our shared values and shared well-being are ultimately kind of where our economic system is taking us.
Yeah, 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 I absolutely agree. So if we go back on what we were saying about the left returning to individualism and tribalism, what do you think it would take? And this, I know this is a very broad question. What do you think it would take for us to get back to that time where we're more communal as a society?
Were we ever?
Well, okay,
It's
okay,
true. Yeah.
fair enough. fair enough. Maybe a bit more. I mean, there was a time where it like right after World War II, there was this sense of community. We were rebuilding a world. We had defeated Nazism and fascism, and there was everybody was holding hands, and I mean,
Plus science too. Science, I think, was a big uniter of the population. The excitement of landing on the moon and that sort of thing. Very pro science for a while, and they're not anymore.
and I agree
Yeah.
with you. And this is what
I'm saying them because I'm Canadian too. Them and us.
Well, and you have this kind of antagonism to science again on both the right and the left in the United States, right? So you
Yeah.
have the right retrenching into religion in terms of science denial, in terms of kind of absolutely just feeling like they can assert and define their own realities. And then you have the left that is privileging, anecdote over aggregated data and scientific information, and saying sometimes explicitly that science is a white European male way of knowing, and that we need to kind of elevate other kinds of knowing that really are what humanity depended on for thousands of years and didn't make a whole lot of progress, to be perfectly honest, right? So I think maybe when you talk about that middle of the kind of 20th century and the post-war prosperity, part of what I do hear is a kind of idealism that seems to be somewhat lost right now, right? That there is it's not cool to be idealistic. It's cool to be cynical. I mean, if you look again, if kind of reverting back to kind of mass media or kind of the kinds of fiction that we indulge in, it's increasingly got more and more of a kind of cruel, violent edge to it. And if it doesn't, we see it as something for children, right? So we don't know we seemingly have lost our ability to kind of engage in hopeful communitarian stories and aspirations that don't simply get treated like glurge or pablum. And
Mhm.
I don't know what the answer is to that.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. It does seem like the comment of one of our listeners just put there, Nico. It does seem that we had, anyway, it felt more. I don't have numbers whether we were more communal or not than in the past that we are now, but it seems that and this is just my opinion, but it seems that when the neoliberalism arrived with Ronald Reagan in the United States, and it was Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Brian Mulroney here in Canada, there was a push towards get rich or die trying. We gave up the dreams of using going into space and you know and building a better world. The house of the future and all that stuff kind of stopped. All of a sudden, it was all about the next quarterly profit, and it seems that it seemed to me anyway, and this is just my opinion. I'm no I'm nowhere near as smart as Valerie, but it seems to me that this is when we gave up the idea of working as a community and became more focused on the individual. And I think might be part of the reason that fuels the current crisis and the current division that we have amongst left and right. And am I just completely out to lunch on this? And what do you guys think?
I, I think that it's hard to know exactly, kind of looking back on that. There certainly was a kind of hopefulness during that post-war era, and although I kind of cringe to think about this, Thomas Piketty has written, for example, about the fact that war has this tremendous leveling effect in society, partly by destroying the assets that belong to the rich people. And so in some ways it creates a reset by bringing everybody down to the same level, but also kind of, in the wartime effort, all kinds of people, women, minorities, suddenly they needed everybody on deck, and that opened up opportunities. So when you look at the mid-century and the 20th century, part of that optimism may be kind of coming out of the relief of war. Part of it might be the fact that there was all of these new technologies that had been developed during wartime that were suddenly being used to massively accelerate resource extraction. And so there was a sense of bounty that kind of, as I said earlier, I think a sense of bounty tends to go with hope. It tends to go with people being magnanimous and generous. The sense of scarcity tends to create retrenchment into me and mine. I'm going to take care of me and mine first of all. And I, again, what I don't know what the answer is. I mean, if you look at how our economic system works, in fact, it is very interdependent, right? Even within any kind of given corporation, or within any given sector, people are perfectly capable of both competing and cooperating simultaneously, and kind of having those things happen in some optimal balance with each other. But the rules have changed a lot in ways that privilege competition over cooperation. And then I think on the left, sometimes what I see around me here in Seattle is that people react to that in ways that basically um, leave them kind of indifferent to whether anybody's actually producing food, for example, right? Like they're kind of they're they recognize that there's something deeply wrong with our current system, with the rules of the game, with the way that kind of economics is playing out, with the way that capitalism unfettered has done enormous harm and created enormous inequality. But the people who kind of see the problems most deeply don't always have good solutions. Sometimes the solutions they offer are fairly simplistic and or just poorly thought out.
Yeah, well, I mean, what would be a solution to such a dilemma? It seems to me that, you know, we can't use idealism. We can't use science because even science will tell us. For example, you use the Human Genome Project that basically conclude there's only one human race, but yet we're still to this day fighting about racism. If science comes in and tells us, that we're one species, and which is the definition of communal right there in a way, and it doesn't seem to sink through either on the left or on the right. What do we do? How do we set that message through? I'm
Wait,
asking tough questions, aren't I? I'm sorry.
yeah, and Christine, you're getting like zero airtime, so feel free to jump
Yeah,
in.
yeah, by all means.
Actually, I do. If do you want to take that question first, or shall I dive in?
Go ahead if you've got some
Oh,
thoughts.
okay. I want to return back to critical theory because it's not always critical race theory. It could be like even feminism is a critical theory,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do you think it is being misused in the sense of being deployed against individuals versus against systems and institutions of power? Because I think it's being weaponized in a way. A lot of people weaponize it almost, right?
Yeah, you have this paradox in that people on the left will say, well, for example, a black person isn't capable of racism, or a woman isn't capable of sexism because those isms equal privilege plus power, and
Mhm.
and so right in that you see kind of this kind of paradox, right, in that they're saying, like, yes, at a systemic level that is what it means. And so if we're saying all racism is only systemic racism, all sexism, we're only going to talk about systemic sexism, then why the hell are you calling a person a
That's
racist or a
exactly it.
sexist,
Or a white
right?
supremacist or
Or a white
whatever, right? You know?
supremacist, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
could call
yeah,
them a bigot if you want.
yeah,
um
yeah.
but so people play these word games in which they're saying things that are mutually incompatible, um,
Yeah.
and yeah, that does get weaponized.
Okay. Yeah. Um, Kevin, do you have another question? Because I'm formulating my next one.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, no, you're right. I think it is being. Oh God, where was I going with this?
Well, it's being abused as a theory. I think it's being abused personally because it's such a powerful theory to allow you to look at systems of power and, for example, architecture, right? That's I forget what the park is called, but where they basically build the bridges, too low for the people of color and the poor people to get into this park, right? So right there, if you think about that, you can't look at architecture as neutral ever again, and that's powerful, you know. But when you start, obviously the guy who built the park, you can point at him and say that's an explicit racist, but I mean it's a system of power, right? It's a um,
But at the same
I
time, we
gave
have
an
to be careful.
example. What's that?
We have to be careful to say that, not deny that this kind of
That's
systemic.
exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's undeniably, like you say, remnants of, prior, sexism,
Oh
racism,
yeah,
all those
absolutely.
things exist. But,
There's no denying the
um,
systemic racism in Canada and the U.S. Uh,
yeah,
So I
but
think that
minorities.
just because I have white skin doesn't mean I'm white supremacist. I mean, but they'll say, and it makes sense to say, if you're looking through that particular lens, that I support white supremacy just because I'm white. And I can, understand that, right? Like, it kind of doesn't make sense, but when it's explained in the right kind of way, because white people have been oppressed for a long time. And so I understand what they're saying there, but it's not like, they're talking about people running around in hoods and this kind of thing, right? They're talking about a structure, but yet they apply that word to an individual, right?
I mean, isn't that the definition of racism, that you take somebody based on these, or sexism or whatever it is, you kind of treat someone as if they represented some aggregate, simply based on an accident of birth that they had no control over, and independent of whatever their own actions might be or their own.
Oh. I think we lost Valerie for half a second there. She said she might be having issues with the Wi-Fi.
No, those theories are super powerful. You just talk about the Frankfurt School, and they were, looking at the structures that allowed Nazism to happen, right? So we're talking old white guys started this. I'm talking about the Frankfurt School, right? Old white guys who were interested in the structures of power that led to the uprising of Nazism, right? Yeah. And then there's the Birmingham School. You're familiar with Stuart Hall?
I'm not.
Okay. He was a Jamaican British scholar, one of the founders of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. And 30 years ago, I've been, reviewing a few of his works or whatever, and he was saying he was concerned about how it's being taken up in America, and that it itself was becoming an institution of power, right? If that makes sense. And he talked about even, how it's becoming, when he founded that school, the feminists wanted to join it. And, at first it was like, nah, we don't want them. But he stuck up for them and said, yeah, we need them here, kind of thing, right? So he talks about how he was marginalized and how he got, then he became the old guard. And he was the one doing the marginalizing, right? Like, just this insight into what, he also talked about how in the States, it was already becoming a financial, where those women got hardly any funding at all. All of a sudden, Americans were getting tons of funding for this kind of work, right? So I thought it was very interesting, his observations 30 years ago, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Institutionalization of I don't know, anti-institutionalization or something. I don't know what to make of that, but
I think that if people who kind of are in this progressive sector of society were really focused, as they claim to be, on addressing systemic issues like what you're describing, right? Or kind of cascading intergenerational effects of sexism and racism, which play out both in systems and in individuals, frankly. But if you're kind of if people were working on that, I think there would be less reactivity on the right. There would still be resistance and reactivity, and kind of people who feel like somebody else's gain is their loss. Right? There would be that aspect of it, but there's a lot more reactivity that comes from things like Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi, right? Who are basically dehumanizing kind of people whose turn it is they think to be dehumanized, right? So you've got group dynamics in Seattle, if you're listening, where people are saying, essentially, to young white guys, young straight white men, there's no place for you in our aspirational future. We don't really care about your suffering, because people like you have had it too good for too long, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that guy has had it too good for too long, but but when you challenge them on that, they're like, well, yeah, but we're talking about systems. Well, then again, if you're talking about systems, let's address the systems instead of kind of shunning and shaming and stigmatizing this individual and saying like that he doesn't get to be included in kind of programs that lift people up, or in kind of, in beat poetry, whatever it is that they're being excluded from, right? So I think that there is this, and people feel that, and people are reactive to it. As Van Jones once pointed out, we're telling young white men, that we have no interest in them and their problems, go away. And then you've got real white supremacist groups who are saying, we care about you. We see your pain. Come over here. And
that's how Hitler did it, isn't it?
It's exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And you see that so clearly just about everywhere because I think, for example, in media, for example, there's no doubt that on the right side of the spectrum, there's much more money, there's much more voices, there's much more media, and they're much more well funded. So even on this very show, I was accosted by a friend who basically told me, he said, why are you giving some time for right wing issues and stuff like that, and right wing voices, or more right wing voices? We know what they're talking about. We know they hate us. Why there's so few of us
They
on that?
don't though.
But that's the thing, right?
They're nice. They're quite nice people, you know.
But
Um,
it goes back to
where some
tribalism.
people on the left are not nice, you know.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
there's nice, not nice on either side, obviously, but it goes back to that tribalism that we were discussing earlier, right? And
Mm.
if we're gonna just lock ourselves up into this echo chamber of we're just gonna say talk left on the left and right on the right, how are we ever possibly going to be able to bridge and come together to defeat something much greater than ourselves politically? Something like climate change, for example. It's a much bigger problem. We can't just the left tackle climate change and the right not do it. We need to come together to be able to tackle something like that.
Mm.
Val, as the resident smart one here, where do we even start? Where do we even start?
Kevin, I'm not the smart one. I just have big words. My family would tell you that. I just use a bunch of big words, and so it makes
I just have a big nose. That's what it's
sound
always-
smarter than I am. But to answer your question about that, about kind of left and right coming together, part of the challenge is that we get an adrenaline rush from conflict, right? And from this sense of being beleaguered. And that's where you have people saying, are we actually going to even survive social media as a culture, as a society? Because you've got an incentive structure that taps into creating anxiety, conflict, tension, exaggeration, extremism, right? All of those things. And we just simply can't afford it. We've got some stuff in front of us that is so big, we just can't afford it. So like people sometimes say to me, look, you say you're on the left, so how come you're always criticizing the left? And I say back, well, for one thing, because I have no access to a right-wing audience. Secondly, because to my mind, a big sector of the right has simply gone off a cliff and is completely unreachable at this point. Even if I could figure out how to get to part of that audience, I can't figure out how to have a kind of thoughtful kind of conversation with those folks that would leave both of us changed. And then thirdly, we can't afford to have the left going down the same kind of ugly rabbit holes the right is going down, being identitarian, being invested in controversy, being disinterested in solutions that are universal solutions, right? Being attracted to anything that has an edge to it more so than anything that is actual, tangible, practical problem solving. We just can't afford it. And so I have my hopes pinned on the left. Which, because I feel so hopeless about the right now, which is why I'm kind of criticizing the left.
I think
calling out your own. You're calling out your own, right?
And isn't that exactly what we wish the right would do?
Yes.
That we wish
Exactly,
that thoughtful
yeah.
people on the right would kind of engage in constructive criticism of their own part of the political spectrum, and to try to move people into more constructive action and less ideology.
It's like what I always say. A friend will throw you flowers. A real friend will throw you the vase once in a while. And it's true, right? I mean, your real friend will actually criticize you once in a while too. Beware somebody who only throws you flowers all the time.
Yep.
What's the other one? A friend will help cover the murder, but a real friend will come with a shovel, right? Something like that.
The carpet and the oh man. So it's such a broad conversation we're having here, and God knows we can go into every tangent. I mean, and especially when we're atheists, I think it becomes even more so. I mean, here's a quick anecdote. We were having a discussion with this woman, and we were having an interview with her, and when we went off air, and she was preparing for a debate on abortion. And I suggested to her, oh, well, you should talk to such and such individual. He's a good resource, on matters of the law, according to abortion. And her first reaction was, fuck that guy. And I said, well, why? And, because he apparently said one thing that she didn't quite agree with him. And I was thinking, it's like, you know, your bigger fight here is to re- repel, you know, the forces that are trying to destroy Roe versus Wade. Can you really afford to lose allies because you have one disagreement with this person, right? And we do this way too easily. We just brush aside people that are actual allies, and just because we have one or two points of disagreement. And I keep making that point. I mean, there's three of us right here on this podcast. I mean, if we put a piece of paper, we write down 20 subjects, there is no way all three of us will agree exactly on those 20 subjects, but yet we are all here having discussions as friends. And it seems that we way too easily dismiss, on the left anyway, dismiss somebody right offhand because we don't agree with one or two things they've said. And I think this is to our detriment as compared to the right. The right, they seem to just like, oh, you just gotta own the left and they're good. You know, we're friends as soon as you own somebody on the left. So, God,
Well,
I don't
it's
even
a
know where to go with this.
again, it's a lot easier to be contrarian and to tear things down and to stop things from happening than it is to actually be constructive and to make positive things happen. But yes, regarding like that, so that sense that I talked to somebody who has spent 30 years of his life kind of running a very effective national environmental group, and he said, sometimes right now we have people coming in to these job applications who are like, well, we can't work with them. They don't agree with us on this. You know, like they basically have a checklist. And he said, our philosophy has always been, can we find anything that we agree on? And then let's come together with these folks who may be across the political aisle, who maybe kind of have a very different strategy than us, whatever. But like, let's find the things that we can agree on and then work on that in community with each other, even if there's all this other stuff that we disagree on. And so they ended up kind of having to write that into their job descriptions because they were getting all of these young folks coming out of environmental studies or women's studies or whatever, you know, whatever it is, like who were kind of so ideological that they felt like they couldn't work with anybody who didn't kind of check all the boxes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sorry, Christina, were you asking a question there?
No,
Go ahead.
I was muttering. Yes, that's it.
There was a time in our parents' generation, where you didn't talk politics, you didn't talk religion, you didn't even talk sports, and they seem to be getting along as a community better. And we live in a time now we want to encourage talking about these subjects, but do we really need to go back to this kind of mentality as a society? Are we capable as humans to tackle these subjects? Seems to me at this point we might not be able to.
In 2 weeks, I'm hosting a family reunion. So I'm the oldest of six kids, right? And my one of my sisters is a kind of Rush Limbaugh loving kind of Christian evangelical, but more kind of wedded to the political right than to even kind of evangelical conservatism. One of them is a kind of Dutch reform, kind of evangelical, um, and one of them, there's my brother who's an agnostic, bit of a floozy, my other sibling who believes in no sex outside of marriage. I'm obviously an outspoken atheist, former evangelical, and then there's my gay brother, and who's also agnostic, and the other siblings think he's going to hell, as am I. So it's like as somebody once said, and then my mom who just pretends that none of it's happening.
Yeah, that's right. That's our generation, right?
That would work for me.
And so somebody once listened to the description and said, "Oh my God, that is one spicy stew." But the fact is, we enjoy each other. We will have a great week together. The person who has the hardest time doing zipper lips is this one right here. Me personally, I need to keep my mouth shut about the things we disagree with. But what we do find is that we can come into our common ground, find our shared values, find our shared caring for each other, find our center in our shared enjoyment of nature and being kind of in beauty together, and 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 that, it doesn't solve the world's problems, but I think it matters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think you got a very good point there.
Well,
That,
I'm, a small family, mom, dad, me, and my daughter, but we talk about politics, and but we're all on the same page mostly. We're all non-believers. Um, my dad and I are straight up atheists. My daughter and my mom call themselves agnostic, and dad and I are like, yeah, you're really an atheist, right? All this kind of stuff, and we can talk politics and argue about it. They even get pretty vocal, but at the end of the day, it's like, I love you. Nice to have you over for dinner or to go for dinner, whatever, right? Like you know. Um, and it's fun. It's like that kind of arguing. I see more like an intellectual exercise, just bouncing ideas off one another. And like I said, we agree on most stuff, but that little 1% is really fun to argue about in the spirit of exchanging ideas.
mhm.
So
Mhm.
if you're lucky enough to have people like that in your realm that you can have that kind of argument over the dinner table, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would be interesting to see if your family wasn't related by blood. I mean, family
Well,
blood ties is a powerful thing that kind of keeps a lot of people together. If it wasn't related by blood, would you still have the same dynamics? That's a very interesting.
probably because we're all atheists, maybe, and a lot of it has to do with religion and whoops, how politics is being infiltrated by bullshit, and and then we get on to world events, and then things get really heated because we just want to yell at everything as a team sometimes, right? But yeah, yeah,
Valerie,
That's such a good question
fun.
you asked, though, Kevin, because I think that is something that is a real challenge that is worth us thinking about. Like, when you're family together, you have a sense that your destiny is entangled, right? Your history is entangled, your destiny is entangled. You start often from an assumption of caring, an assumption that there is some fundamental worthiness or goodness in the other person that you believe is there independent of their politics or independent of their religion, right? Whereas when people aren't family, it's easier, not just a little, it's a lot easier, I think, to kind of reduce them to cartoon characters, right? Well, I know I know who you voted for, and that's all I need to know about you.
Mhm.
And so I think one question as we think about what does it mean to hold in some ways the complicated center, to kind of hold, to create bridges in society that keep us from literally blowing apart into dysfunction and civil war. How can we start from that basic assumption of goodness and worthiness, and and then ask ourselves as we listen, not what we can critique, which is where I often tend to go. It's
mhm.
my natural instinct to say, yeah, but, yeah, but, yeah, but, yeah, but, right, as somebody else is talking. But start from asking ourselves the question of what it is that we can actually find anywhere in what they're saying that we can agree with.
I think we're in a lot of trouble as a society at this point because, as you were saying there, on the right, Christianity, right there from the get go, has from basic principle that we are sinners and liars and thieves and stuff like that, and unworthy of trust. And since we're not listening to science anymore, apparently, which science has kind of told us, that, yeah, we're all the same species, we're all one people, and we prefer to listen to rhetoric and Christianity, yeah, that kind of seems like it looks very bleak for the future. As the psychologist, Valerie, what do you think the individual should do to in their own life to start fighting that to get back to maybe a more communal sense?
One thing I find is that people are often surprisingly better in real life than they are in the abstract, right? So, like, things can go ugly between neighbors, but there's also a lot of generosity and grace and compassion between people who know each other, and and so I think part of the answer may be unplugging from some of this stuff, right? Like uh, you, we like to think that we as individuals, like each of us, like to tell ourselves that we're immune from advertising, that we're not getting manipulated, that kind of our Facebook feed certainly isn't poisoning us, right? It's everybody else. um, but that's baloney. um, and I think that, so part of it is people actually having to get to the point where they say, this stuff is not constructive, it's actually toxic for me, or I'm spending my time churning about things that I have no power to make a difference at. And then ask yourself, where do I have the ability to make a difference? And sometimes that's really small and close to home, right? And sometimes it is as simple as mean people suck and practice random acts of kindness, right? And then kind of what you do is start there and say, are there small ways that then I can add goodness to society at large, knowing that it's not just the folks on the other side of the aisle, or the folks who are the other race or whatever it is, who are shitty, that as Václav Havel said, the dividing line between good and evil goes down the center of each human heart.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that was thank you so much, Valerie. That was a God. We only scratched the surface of that subject. We could probably go forever. But if people want to find out more about you and where can they get your books and all that, where can they go? Be shameless, plug yourself. Go right ahead there.
My articles are at valerietarico.com, and you'll find links also there to my book, Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical, looks at old beliefs in a new light. And well, what else is there to say? That's probably the easiest. There's also a book of children's stories that I wrote for my daughters way back when, but that is probably far less of interest to your audience.
Well, some of us have children. Mine's
Yeah,
not. Mine's an adult child now, but there's people out there that have little kids, and they probably love to read something like that to their kids. So, yeah.
thank you so much, Valerie, for all this. I really appreciate this. But before I let you go, I got to have you say, hi, this is Valerie Tarico, and I took a left at the valley.
Hi, this is Valerie Tarico, and what?
I took a left at the valley.
Hi, this is Valerie Tarico, and I took a left at the valley.
Fantastic.